Hello and welcome to our study of the way of the Bodhisattva. We students who would like to become Bodhisattvas, we would like to become kind people, patient people. And in the previous chapter that we then completed, we have in fact been looking at patience, which is essential really. And we talk about the way of the Bodhisattva being divided into three sections. The first is identifying bodhicitta and making it take root. And then we would say, once it's taken root, once we identify the value of bodhicitta, then it's very important that it doesn't diminish. And so we would say the first three chapters of the way of the Bodhisattva, and let me just actually get that chapters right. So the first three chapters of the way of Bodhisattva are very much about us embracing the vision and the practice of bodhicitta. So these are chapter 1, the excellence of bodhicitta. Chapter 2, leaving aside negative actions or confession. And then taking hold of bodhicitta. So those were the first three chapters. And that's very much about us seeing how important it is. It's sort of like the whole movement that would say, you know, make love, not war, you know, believing in world peace. But that's all really nice. That's definitely valid. But as far as world peace goes, what we very often see is this sad phenomenon, which is that you're an idealist until you're 30, and then you become a realist, and then you go from being very selfless and then into being selfish, and that seems to be completely okay. And that's why idealism sometimes is seen as being naive. And this is, you could say, predictable. At the same time, that would be very sad if we have a vision of what's good, constructive, and helpful, and then we give up on it. And that's where it's really important that we then have what actually prevents bodhicitta from declining. And so the next three chapters, they're then carefulness, vigilant introspection, and patience. So carefulness is just being aware of how important it is what we do, and being really understanding how negative attitudes can really be destructive. And that's particularly then, you could say, further discussed in the chapter on vigilant introspection or awareness, which is simply knowing what's happening in my mind. And that's where when we lapse into just plain anger or plain, you could say, antagonistic attitudes, then we're aware that it's happening. It's not just we're blindly tagging along, that where we normally are rather unconscious, and these things, they just happen, they come out of they're reflected in our physical actions, in our verbal actions, but they come from the mind. And that's where, rather than just stopping what we say and stopping what we do, that we're actually aware of what's behind it. And that requires an awareness of what's happening in our mind. And that's very often lacking. And that's where we need vigilant introspection. And so then we have the practice of patience. And patience is not sort of gritting our teeth and bearing and putting up with impossible circumstances, but it is very much this understanding of the wisdom of not giving in to anger, to understand that once we're held by anger, our actions are not that smart. We fail in our projects, and particularly we accumulate incredible negativity from which it's very difficult to extract ourselves. And these, you could say, these cycles become part of our patterning. And that's where we also, so there we address this issue both from the point of view of just being practical in this world, understanding the other, but also from the point of view of absolute insight into what is really there, heart intelligence. And that's where we have this understanding on the basis of relative truth, understanding how the others are conditioned and absolute truth. How understanding that the subject that's perceiving anger and the object that's perceiving anger have no inherent existence, and that's being ultimately realistic. So that's where in both cases we address this issue of anger, and that's how we define patience. So this is very important because there's plenty of opportunity to practice this, and there's plenty of opportunity if we don't practice it, we really create circumstances for things not working out. And so that's where for bodhicitta to flourish, then once we have developed it, we need to also have these aspects of carefulness, vigilant introspection, and patience in place. So that's preventing bodhicitta from declining. As we actually have here in the dedication at the end, we actually have these lines. We say, may bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be. So these are the first 3 chapters that address this. Where it has arisen, may it never fail. That's the next 3 chapters. But grow and flourish ever more and more. That's then what the last 3 chapters will be about. So we shall now proceed to the chapter on endeavor, which is virya in Sanskrit, and which is sometimes translated in different ways, sometimes as diligence, sometimes as energy, sometimes as vigor. And it has this element of application, but more than just application, also the application that's permeated by a degree of joy or enthusiasm, if you like, in which then there's an actual momentum that we joyfully participate in, and which is very, very creative. So we'll look at that chapter. We'll begin this today, and we'll just begin with the opening chants, where we say, abandon evil doing, practice virtue well, subdue your mind. This is the Buddha's teaching. Like a star, an optical illusion, or a flame, a magical illusion, a dewdrop, or a bubble, like a dream, a flash of lightning, or a cloud, so should one consider all compounded things. In the jewels of the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, we take refuge until we attain enlightenment. By the merit of practicing generosity and the like, may we attain Buddhahood for the benefit of beings. In the jewels of the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, we take refuge until we attain enlightenment. By the merit of practicing generosity and the like, may we attain Buddhahood for the benefit of beings. In the jewels of the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, we take refuge until we attain enlightenment. By the merit of practicing generosity and the like, may we attain Buddhahood for the benefit of beings. So, presently then, looking at the text. So, chapter 7, endeavor. So His Holiness says, after generating bodhicitta and taking steps to prevent it from deteriorating, we must now learn to develop it continuously. This is the subject of Shantideva's next 3 chapters, the first of which is devoted to endeavor. Why is endeavor necessary? If we consider material progress, we see that research started by one person can always be continued by another. But this is not possible with spiritual progress. The realization we talk about in Buddha Dharma is something that has to be accomplished by the individual. No one else can do it for us. Of course, it would be wonderful if in the future we could attain realization through some sort of new injection or by means of a new generation of computers without having to go through any difficulties. If we could be absolutely certain that such a time would come, we could simply lie back and wait to get enlightened. But I doubt this will ever happen. It's better to make an effort. We have to develop endeavor. And this again reflects how the Buddhist path is not based on an accumulation of data. It's not about an accumulation of things that exist objectively. It's about a transformation within the subjective. And that's where there is only one place that this can be addressed, and that is from the place of the deluded individual persevering in the applying the measures that will diminish delusion so that we don't keep perpetuating habitual delusion. But this can only be addressed from the point of view of the individual. So this is not something that can be known objectively. This needs to be dealt with on the basis of the individual. So that's where it's not useful if we just have the Buddhas who say, well, this is how it is. As long as we don't have that, then of course it's useful with a body of knowledge that speaks about this. But at the end of the day, we need to apply this to ourselves, just as we might have like having an illness that is curable. It's not enough that we just know that it can be cured, but we actually need to be cured. Some, like His Holiness says, no one else can do it for us. And then His Holiness alludes to this sort of naive idea of what we could call promissory science, that, you know, we should just relax because sometimes in the future, some solution just might come along. We naively believe that something like a pill or some technology would come along. This is, of course, a theme that has been trending in recent times in view of some politicians that think that the sort of objective of zero emissions, we shouldn't worry about that. There will be some technology in the future that might come along and just deal with it. So we can just sort of tag along with how we've always been doing things without disturbing anybody's sensitivities. So this is where probably a healthy degree of skepticism is justified, and that's where we certainly, from the point of view of looking at our own mind, knowing what's at large there, we also know that this only will come about on the basis of our personal application, not on the basis of some external agent or some miracle for which there's absolutely no logical basis that would function. Essentially, thinking of the mind in terms of being something that can be known objectively or mechanistically is actually what we would call a category mistake. Mind as such is not something that exists as an object. It simply doesn't lend itself to that. And that, of course, is where we have a remarkable science that can identify a lot of the workings in terms of the external world, and we can navigate the material. The mind doesn't lend itself to that. And that's where really the most important aspect of our entire existence, which resides within our subjective consciousness and our experience, is simply not the scope of that kind of objectivist science. So that's where we can't rely on this kind of idea of computers or artificial intelligence and all of that. As sophisticated as it might be, it just doesn't go there. It's a different category. So it comes down to we're going to have to apply ourselves, and applying ourselves then means that we actually have to move. It's not about moving external things. It will be about moving this place within, where our attitudes and in which our belief systems, and where basically we have what we call the obscurations that veil our innate clarity, where they abide. That's where we need to move. That's where we need to actually do something. So, like Zola says, we have to develop endeavor. So Shantideva, opening this chapter, then says, thus, with patience I will strive with diligence, for in such diligence enlightenment is found. If no wind blows, then nothing stirs, and neither is there merit without diligence. So something's going to have to happen. That's why we can't accept the status quo or rely on some miracle to just happen. So His Holiness comments, we can be patient in various ways, such as by not thinking ill of those who harm us, or by accepting suffering on the path. So that's patience. Of these two, the latter is more important for generating endeavor, and it is endeavor that enables us to attain enlightenment. So that's where we have to be really on top of really what could diminish our bodhicitta, and that's where then we need endeavor. And Shantideva, then His Holiness quotes Shantideva saying, "In such diligence, enlightenment is found. In the same way that protecting a lamp from the wind allows a flame to burn without flickering, endeavor enables the virtuous mind to grow undisturbed." So again, this is all about being proactive. And again, this is where we need to basically rebel against the idea of meditation and the spiritual path and think about just sitting down, chanting Om and being at harmony with the universe. That doesn't work. It's also not about some misperception about religion in which you're supposed to behave in a particular way. You're supposed to be a good girl or a good boy. That has nothing to do with bodhicitta. But it is then with this vision of this intelligence and this greatness, which bodhicitta is, that we also need to be proactive in not having it blown out by the winds of habitual patterns, predictable regurgitation of familiar habits that we have, and just allowing the status quo of things as they are to just continue. So that's where it has to be this proactive mind. So His Holiness says, what is endeavor? It is finding joy in doing what is good. To that, it is necessary to remove anything that counteracts it, especially laziness. Laziness has three aspects: having no wish to do good, being distracted by negative activities, and underestimating oneself by doubting one's ability. So these discussions of laziness we very often find in the discussions around shamatha practice, in which we do have sort of the initial laziness, which is just being plain dull, slothful, not wanting to do anything, not really thinking in terms of being proactive about what's constructive. And then there's the one where we get very busy. We're so busy that we don't have time for anything that really matters. We're distracted by superficial and negative activity. And finally, there's the idea that I can't possibly do this. I'm just, there's the sublime beings, they're all very sublime and that's very good, but they're very different from me. And that's where I couldn't possibly do this. So these three, we might of course have a lot of sympathy for those who have sort of difficulty moving, for those who are very busy, and for those who sort of underestimate themselves. But at the end of the day, they're just actions that prevent us from moving. And so we're not particularly apologetic about that, and we simply just are calling this laziness. It's something that's getting in the way, it's unnecessary, and it's particularly what then counteracts something that is useful both for ourselves and others, namely bodhicitta. So with regards to laziness, then related, His Holiness says, related to these are taking undue pleasure in idleness and sleep, and being indifferent to samsara as a state of suffering. So that's where we might go, well, I'm okay, things are just fine, plus I'm, I am the way I am, and that's just how it is, and I'd like to take it easy. I don't want to be I don't necessarily feel driven to do anything about anything. So that's where we have that kind of idleness. Shantideva then says, snared by the trapper of defiled emotion, enmeshed and taken in the toils of birth, again, you strayed into the maw of death. What is it? Have you still not understood? So that's where we're presently held by something that, unless we really are insensitive with what's going on within ourselves, and unless we're completely focused on just what's outside, we need to recognize that our being is held by self-centered strategies, deluded or dualistic impulses that originate from, you could say, an innocent place of ignorance. And this is common for all sentient beings. All sentient beings are ultimately innocent, not knowing their own nature. From that, then, there's a sense of self. And from that sense of self, there is all the strategies that are self-centered. And that's what we call kleshas, or conflicting emotions, destructive emotions, or defiled emotions. And that's where we continually perpetuate these cycles in which we regurgitate, where we cycle in suffering in various ways. And that's what we call then the cycle of birth and death. And so once we've arrived at an understanding that this is not helpful, then we need to really begin to extract ourselves. That's where we need to look at ourselves and our sort of predilection for not really doing much, and ask ourselves, what is it that we still haven't understood? So, His Holiness says, all of us want to be happy and to avoid suffering, but because of negative actions, our mind are never at peace. As they arise, negative thoughts disturb our mind and create a negative atmosphere around us. Furthermore, these emotions make us liable to suffer in the future whenever we encounter difficult circumstances. While they persist, how can we tolerate them? We know that we shall die, but how can we tell when? From this moment on, we must generate endeavor. So that's why, again, we need to understand what is happening with us and understand how grave actually these destructive patterns are. Something needs to give. We need to do this while we can. And since we know that we're going to be here for a very short time, there has to be this application. We need to generate endeavor. And that's why we need to understand endeavor here doesn't mean getting busy with our mouth or our behavior. It doesn't mean that we all of a sudden should adopt a particular style, but it's about being onto the mind that gets caught up in these particular habitual patterns. And that's where practice is needed. And then once practice is needed, then of course this also translates into actions. But we need to first seize this issue at the root. But to deal with all of that, there has to be this sense of urgency. Shantideva says, death will swoop on you so swiftly. Gather merit till that moment comes. For even if you then throw off your indolence, what will you do when there is no more time? So that's where we might end up at the end of our life without actually really having persevered in what really matters. And then at the end of the life saying, gosh, something needs to be done. Throwing off our indolence, focusing on spiritual practice, just very difficult for us to then have the right conditions. At that time, we'll probably be suffering from all sorts of circumstances that make it difficult to practice. And the thing is also, we don't know when this will come. Anyway, Shantideva will be discussing that. His Holiness comments, if we wait until the moment of death to decide to make an effort, it will be too late. At that time, we may be in great pain, physically and mentally tortured by fear of the unknown, by the memory of our negative actions, and by attachment to those close to us. So Shantideva says, quoting essentially ourselves, quote, this I have not done, and this I'm only starting, and this I'm only halfway through, end of quote. Then is the sudden coming of the Lord of Death, and oh, the thought, alas, I am finished. Shantideva continues, you look at the faces of your hopeless friends, their tear-stained cheeks, their eyes, their red and swollen eyes, for such will be the depth of their distress, and then you'll see the heralds of the deadly Lord. So take advantage of this human boat. Free yourself from sorrow's mighty stream. This vessel will be later hard to find. The time that you have now, you fool, is not for sleep. You turn your back upon the sacred doctrine, supreme joy and boundless source of bliss. Why delight in mere excitement, in distraction that will cause you misery? So there we are, continually preoccupied with these things that need to be done. This is what stresses us. All those things that we haven't completed, all the things that need to be done, things that have been started and yet we're not really finished with it yet. And then all of a sudden, what will happen is that we'll find a moment when we realize we're going to die. We're finished. And this, of course, is very nice. And you could say this works fine right now. I'm comfortably sitting here and discussing that. And we say, yes, that's so true. And we sort of nod, it's very meaningful and so on. But when it really happens, then it's something that hits us so deeply that we'll be totally overwhelmed emotionally. And also those that care for us will be deeply, deeply emotional. So that's where at that time it'll be very difficult to actually have the peace of mind to be clear. Right now we have that. And that's where Shantideva is not going to be somebody that stands at somebody's deathbed and gloat and say, hey, I told you so. That's not how it works. Of course, at that time, every measure will be taken from, you could say, all the reflections of the three jewels, our teachers and what have you. But the thing is, something needs to be done right now. So Shantideva's point is we need to take advantage of the possibility that's here, right now. So that's where sort of not really paying attention to all the teachings, all the sources of joy, then we end up being entangled in what is really just distracting us. So His Holiness then comments, most people do not want to hear about death, let alone reflect upon it. But if we have trained our minds and can face death with confidence and a fully positive attitude, then we will have nothing to fear. In the meantime, throughout our life, these qualities will help us a great deal. So while we have this precious human life with which we can achieve so much, let us not be overwhelmed by the laziness of feeling disinclined to positive actions. So that's why right now there is every reason to presently work with this, and this will enable us to have confidence at the time of death. This is something that we see again and again in the lives of great masters who display tremendous confidence, tremendous dignity, and who can die peacefully. Conversely, when someone doesn't know where they're going into, there will be this incredible fear of what is unknown. And so that's where it's very important for us, of course, to right now not get sidetracked by superficial, unintelligent impulses that lead us away to what really actually could bring us into a good place. And it's not just at the time of death, but like His Holiness says, throughout our life, these qualities will help us a great deal. So His Holiness then entering into a rather important discussion, which is significant in the modern context, His Holiness says, and this is actually where His Holiness very compassionately is someone who actually addresses this whole discussion. In this connection, we should consider the subject of rebirth, which Buddhism defines as the continuity of the mind from one life to the next. A future consciousness depends on a previous consciousness, of which it is the continuation. It cannot be produced by something other than consciousness. Consciousness, and not something else, must be the cause of future consciousness. And this is actually where we have a common ground. You could say there's a common epistemic ground. There's a common scientific logic that applies both to Buddhism and to science as we know it in the modern context, materialist science or natural sciences, where everywhere in nature we can observe that results are connected to the result. So we have an apple seed. It doesn't give rise to a pumpkin. It gives rise to an apple tree. We have particular chemical processes where we can identify how the result is linked to the cause, and we can reproduce these particular processes. And that's where we can talk about something that's verifiable, something that's empirical. And similarly also, we would say consciousness belongs to such a category. It is something that verifiably does not come out of something just out of the blue. It comes from previous moments of consciousness. This we can verify. So that's why Buddhists and modern science, they have a common premise in terms of observing a particular subject and, you could say, extracting or deducing how this particular effect comes about. And we can see there is a relationship, a complementary relationship between the cause and the effect. And that way we can say something like consciousness does not have any kind of, you could say, it cannot be originate from something that's not consciousness. It can't come about from something that is matter, even though we're talking about subtle neurobiological systems and so forth. They're not complementary. There's no relationship between consciousness, which is an experience of, like we talked about before. It's not something that is objective. It's something that is experience, something that gives rise to first-person experience with all that comes with that, doesn't belong to something that is not conscious. And that's where there's, again, you could say, this category mistake, where we might, that because the prevalence of our materialist science, then, and where the scope really only is that which is material, which is of course very good and we benefit from it, etc., etc. But that's where the scope of that particular science doesn't include this thing called consciousness. And as I'm always quoting David Chalmers, a philosopher of philosophy and science, as a statement he made in an observation he made in the 90s and presented to the community of neuroscientists, really is that the understanding of consciousness is the hard problem of science. It's something that is not understood. And by its own humble admission, a lot of insight, a lot has been known on the basis of neuroscience and its findings and the understanding of the correlation between, you can say, the physical, the brain, and so on, and our experience. Certainly there's correlations, but understanding the actual nature of what consciousness is not known to modern science. And that's where there's a lot of interesting dialogue taking place right now between scientists, materialist scientists, and those that represent then the traditions of insight into consciousness. And we have these dialogues such as the Mind Life Institute, where interesting discussions are taking place across, you could say, the boundaries of these particular camps. So that's where this is something that for the modern person needs to be quite clear, that as much as materialist science is an authority on what is material, not authoritative on the account of what it has to do with consciousness. Just like Buddhists, they would probably admit that their technology is not that cutting edge either. So that's where, that's a joke, that's an understatement, but this is where we could say we have two camps of equally valid science, but one has specialized in the material, one is specialized in consciousness. One brings about comfort, physical comfort, one brings about enlightenment. So these, of course, needn't be in conflict. They can be very complementary. And of course, for us to practice the Dharma, we're dependent on a lot of material circumstances. So these two, you could say, tremendous sciences could very well work together with great advantage. And this, of course, is His Holiness's point in these discussions. Anyway, here, then His Holiness says, we have to understand here the distinction between gross and subtle consciousness. In general, consciousness is associated with the brain and its chemical processes. But in my opinion, it is only the gross consciousness that is determined by such factors. It is true that gross consciousness related to the activities of seeing, hearing, and so forth depend on the human body and its sense organs. What we call human consciousness is the gross consciousness that uses the human body as a support. The consciousness that form other forms of life, such as animals, possess it different because their brains are different. So that's where, again, this is something that we discuss in the Abhidharma, is that you generally have consciousnesses that are generated in relation to an object and then a sense organ from which then there is a consciousness that emerges. For example, a perception of an object, a particular perception generates this image of an experience on the basis of a faculty. So there's very much you could say, a presence of the physical in this experience of consciousness as we ordinarily understand it. There's definitely a relationship taking place. And these, again, are different according to the different kind of beings there are. Obviously, a fly has a different way. Its eyes work in a different way, and different animals, their brains and faculties work in a different way. His Holiness continues, it would be difficult, however, to prove rebirth simply on the basis of the gross consciousness of the different sense organs that use the brain as support. These gross consciousnesses appear as the sense organs develop in the womb. But the consciousness that continues from life to life is a subtle consciousness, the faculty of experiencing and being aware, the natural clarity of the mind. If there were no cause for this subtle consciousness, such as the previous slide, subtle consciousness, the idea of rebirth would in fact be difficult to explain. So that's when we talk about the consciousness that we could say that continues and that continues to re-embody itself. That, of course, is this experience of first-person subjectivity, that quality of being cognitive. And when in Buddhism we talk about the natural clarity of the mind, we're not talking about clarity as opposed to being dull, but we're simply talking about the natural capacity to know, the cognitive quality. Whatever it is that we're knowing, there is this absence of being just inanimate. There is the animate quality. And that's what we call the natural clarity of the mind. So that's where this is then what that re-embodies itself. So His Holiness says, leaving aside memory, which allows us to remember, for example, the experiences of our youth, we all have latent and unconscious tendencies that arise under certain circumstances and influence the way our minds react. Such tendencies are the product of powerful experiences in the recent or distant past, which cause us to react unconsciously without our necessarily remembering those experiences. It's difficult to explain these tendencies and how they manifest other than by saying they are the imprint of past experiences on the subtle consciousness. So that's where in the Buddhist say science of mind, then there's a very clear understanding of how consciousness operates. And that's, of course, on the level of the gross consciousnesses, which is just simply the perceptions that we have of perceptions of very kind of qualia, where we perceive colors, we hear sounds, and we have tastes, tactile perceptions, etc. Then there's the subtle aspects of our consciousness, which has to do with then the aspects of memory, feelings, and what we sometimes then would refer to as the unconscious, but there's really just more subtle levels of consciousness. And that's where we then talk about the subtle aspects of consciousness, such as the mere fact that we perceive self, the mere fact that we impute on what in fact is just, you could say, an existent phenomenology of experience. We then impute me and saying my experience. And that again is something that originates out of a basic fundamental delusion that takes place within even more subtle consciousness that we then refer to as the all ground. So these particular subtle consciousnesses, they're not necessarily contingent just on the experience of external objects. So, and also these are not necessarily just uniquely about the particular, you could say, motorical skills or the faculties that are developed in the womb. So His Holiness says, when we talk about the Big Bang theory to explain the origin of the universe, as Buddhists, we would have to say that the Big Bang itself has a cause. Everything is the product of an infinite chain of causes and effects, but we can not, in fact, find an original cause to all of this. There is no beginning to consciousness, to the series of our rebirth, or to the particles that make up the universe. It is simply the nature of things. Now, when we say simply here, it means it is nakedly the nature of things. It is where we need to just make a very clear, or need to arrive at a clear conclusion, that phenomena don't ever achieve any actual existence as such. There's a web of causes and conditions, and everything that appears on the basis of causes, that again appear on the basis of causes, and as such, there's never ever what we could call an original beginning of anything. And that is where, of course, this confounds the normal mind that would like to think in terms of things as solidly existent and must have come about at a certain time, or as something that then must end at a certain time. Appearances, they come into existence and appearances end. But the actual web of causes and conditions and the actual existence of things do not possess this quality of having been made up at a particular time. So that's where we are going into a dimension of what we then in Buddhism know as shunyata, that there's simply nothing that can be grasped in terms of time and space, and there's nothing that actually comes into existence. Phenomena are ultimately, they don't possess the solidity that they appear to have. This all you could say, the phenomena that we experience, they all work fine in terms of just the functioning, and that is the scope of ordinary science, the way that things function, and that's all very valid. We can use that to predict how things operate and so forth. It's very helpful. Thing is, when we begin to analyze things, to look into these questions of what things are and how they originate and so on, that's where we come up to what we in Buddhism call absolute truth, which is the unborn nature of phenomena. Now, as Ola says, within this context, phenomena are analyzed according to the effects they produce or according to their interdependence. Concerning analysis in terms of interdependence, we say that if the effect exists, the cause exists. This is true for the mind as it is for particles. When we mix two chemical substances, a chemical reaction occurs and a new substance is produced. Similarly, if a very short-tempered person practices loving kindness for a long time, his character will slowly change. Of course, he or she may not completely get rid of their tendency to become angry, but they will be less liable to do this. This transformation of their character takes place because of the interdependence between two types of consciousness, angry and loving. Regarding analysis in terms of the effect produced, we can talk about a chemical reaction as a change of entropy. It is the same for the mind. If one contemplates the harmful effects of anger and the beneficial effects of love, one gains a new confidence in the power of love, and one's tendency to love grows stronger and stronger. This is the nature of things, and it is important to appreciate. I don't know if this Buddhist idea of nature will satisfy everybody, but it does answer a good many questions. So this is where we need to understand how phenomena don't actually exist and possess an inherent existence that is unchanging and solid as we perceive it. And that's where the whole Buddhist, you could say the meta idea that is behind this is what the Buddhists will observe is that anytime you analyze anything, you will come down to just causes and conditions without finding any unchanging, permanent, unconditional essence. So we might not even need to call this Buddhism, but just simply analysis. But this, of course, is a profound insight. It's not always that some of the sciences that we are habituated with or familiar with, they necessarily go there. They're more interested in just in how things function, and that's all very good. But the implication is that if things don't possess an inherent unchanging essence, that means that they are workable. Just like we can work with chemical reactions, we can work with the mind. So that's where it's interesting when we sometimes say, oh, I am in a particular way. Well, this is just how I am. You know, I'm a straight shooter. I say what I think. Or I really am very attached to this and I can't let go of it, or whatever. We might say, I am in a particular way. And that's where this sometimes actually leads to a kind of a laziness where we just sort of go along with the status quo and think, well, I can't change. And that's exactly what we are challenging here. Of course, here we're talking about some other discussions as well, which you could say touch on some big topics, which are definitely need to be had. But at the same time also, this is something that applies on the very immediate level of our subjective experience, which is this idea that we can't change. And that's the idea, that's where the idea with I'm angry, then I'm angry, and I'm just going to have to wait till that passes. But that's where, that's a bit like if we have some idea that, you know, once there's a chemical situation, maybe a fire, then you can't do anything about it. But actually, if you come with a fire extinguisher or water, then this can put out the fire. And that's similarly also, if there's anger, this can actually be they can be put out if we, instead of perpetuating thoughts about a particular negative thing that we are thinking moment after moment after moment, where we have an angry thought and that leads us to contemplate angry aspects. We think of a person we dislike, and then the next moment we'll continue that thought about that person and their quality that we dislike, and that leads to another moment. And there's a chain reaction that goes on. Whereas we could, all of a sudden we might be distracted. All of a sudden there might be that our $500 vase falls off a table and cracks. And that's where we immediately shift our attention to something else. This proves that we're not destined to just keep endlessly, like an object in space, continuing thinking about the dislikable features of something. And this means that we can interrupt our train of thoughts. And this is where we could interject thoughts of love. We could begin to have thoughts about somebody that we like. We could begin to think about something that softens us. And when we have thoughts that are about what softens us, there's a place in which this anger begins to be less weak, becomes weakened. It becomes less persistent in our mind. And that's why we refer to these meditations or reflections as antidotes. And they're very important. We would say that if we have strong attachment to something, then we would have thoughts that, for example, if we have a strong attachment to a particular object and we're very worried, then we should think about impermanence and how the fact that it's the nature of anything to not last. And if we're particularly angry, we could soften the mind with thoughts that generate kindness, and so on. So this is where we can understand how these sort of the states of mind, they are very much simply a bit like chemical reactions. So this is where we're not particularly talking about something mystical, where all of a sudden we should start to behave in particular ways or have some sort of revelation in which I will no longer ever be attached. I will no longer ever be angry. We're not waiting for something to sort of just land on us, but we're talking about working with you could say the chemical processes, or you can say the mental processes in which we are in no way destined or doomed to continue along the same trajectory. So his Holiness says, to return to the subject of endeavor, if we want to get rid of the laziness of being disinclined to positive actions, we should think of how short our human lives are. The Sanskrit word for laziness, alasya, means not to make use of. Any positive actions we perform will benefit us now and in the future. On the other hand, letting ourselves be influenced by negative emotions will ruin us in this life and in future lives. So we should also avoid wasting our lives through the second type of laziness, being distracted by negative actions. Recently, one of my friends who two of my friends, they hadn't seen each other for 20 years. And it was because somebody had said something wrong. And so the other party simply refused to talk with that person for more than 2 decades. Then circumstances brought them together. And the person said, you know, 20 years ago, you said this to me. And the other person said, oh, yeah, that was terrible. I am so sorry, and apologized. And that was it. And now they're the best of friends. And you just think 2 decades have to go by for something, 2 decades of perpetuating this sort of thought, this chain of thought, you know, 2 decades of wasted life in which what could have been a friendship is just all of a sudden 20 years go by, and all it took was just a bit of talking together, somebody apologizing, let go of it. And this is where we can see the pointlessness of us sustaining negative actions. And when we're talking about endeavor, yes, that might actually mean the endeavor of going there and talking to somebody or getting over something. And we might think of it as unsurmountable. And actually being on the both sides of this, I sort of was witness to that. It was absolutely impossible to get over that. But you know, then when circumstances came about, it was the easiest thing in the world. There's also Emmanuel Levinas, who talking about the situation after Second World War, where there was very strong hatred between various ethnic groups as a consequence of the war. In fact, talked about how when individuals came together without knowing their ethnic background, just sat as humans, all the ideas and all the prejudice just fell away. He called this the revelation of the face, because when you're face to face with the adversary or the enemy, you cannot sustain the prejudice that has been built up or that persists. And that's where we can be very angry at a person. But when we sit face to face with them, then this falls away. So basically, just to talk about how the patterns are removable. And when we're talking about endeavor, we're not just talking about something about like soldiering on, but it's very much about just being willing to work with our given conditions. Whoops. I've been a little bit taking up the Q&A time here. Apologies. So yes, we should avoid the type of laziness, being distracted by negative actions. Okay. Consciousness doesn't come from matter, as you wonderfully explained, but does the material effect of the subtle consciousness, and does the subtle consciousness affect the material? Well, it does. And that's where this, of course, is something that in the last 150 years has been one of the principal points within what we call quantum physics, to actually understand how the observer influences the perception. But apart from that, within Buddhist analysis, we would say there is actually no such a thing as something material. That is actually anything that we look at, and again, physics would agree with that. Anything that appears as something solid and physical is made up of particles, which are made up of subparticles, etc. Till actually there's nothing that really is there except subtle energy. But what we do is the mind, and that's where the power of the mind is such that it projects solidity onto what in fact is just projection. So in the Buddhist teaching, we would talk about the relative primacy of mind. Of course, we don't attribute ultimate reality to any given phenomena. Doesn't mean if it's what we call material or if it's the external or whatever, or mind itself. You can say ontologically, it doesn't have any absolute reality of any kind. But nevertheless, it has an impact in terms of how we experience, and that is then where the dualistic mind projects solidity onto our perceptions. So so that's where there is definitely an interaction between the consciousness and the material. And there's a question: is clarity? Same with luminosity. The innate nature of clarity and the innate nature of cognizance is luminosity. But again, that is diminished on the basis of ignorance and on the basis of our duality, the kleshas, our karma, and so forth. So this cognitive quality of the mind essentially is diminished into just a sense of self and object. And basically, like I was just talking about, the material perception of the world, as well as the sense of I. And that's where this then veils luminosity. Given the logic and reasoning, given that logic and reasoning is so important to Buddhist science of mind, and how there is assertion that everything is a product of an infinite chain of causes and effect, I have two questions. The word infinite is very vague, right? Not a clear conclusion. And when His Holiness says there is no beginning to consciousness, how can that be in relation to cause and effect? Very good question. How can something that has no beginning, how can something have no beginning according to logic? It seems to depart logic at that point, with no apology for that. Very good, excellent question. Well, that's where we need to identify the difference between relative truth and absolute truth, where we, in the condition of confusion, we construct and diminish the absolute space of reality into a subject and an object. And as much as we do that, and this is what plays out in terms of our experience, both subject, object, and time and space, this is what we perceive. This is where we operate from. We're already probably going to go over time, right? So we have this a clear sense of time, a place, what we have to do, what have you, right? But if we analyze time, if we analyze space, then we begin to see what is absolute. And that's where we see that as much as relatively in our perception, according to the logic, there is cause and effect, then as much as we analyze, we cannot actually find anything that has any beginning. And as much as we have an experience of consciousness, we cannot find a beginning of it. We cannot find a beginning of any matter. We cannot find any substance to matter. We cannot find anything to neither mind nor matter. We don't find any, you could say, foundations for what we call time and space. And that's where we need, in this discussion, we need to look into what is real. And that's where we then begin to look into absolute truth. Of course, without analyzing, yeah, sure, we have all the usual notion of cause and effect, time and space, and so on. So that's where there's a big difference between what we call relative truth and absolute truth. Can you repeat the author book who mentions the revelation of the face? Yeah, Emmanuel Levinas. Levinas, who's French, Lithuanian Jew, and who lived in France, lived most of his life in France. He writes beautifully. He's sort of a philosopher version of Chinli Noburimage. His writing is very dense, but very beautiful. Yeah. Okay. No further questions? Well, then yeah? No? No. Okay. So thank you very much for hanging in here. There's some big, you could say, discussions to be had that we're touching on here, but they are really essential. They are very important. So thank you. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we're born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together. Thank you.